you think of Spore, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Evolution, space, or exploration? It surely is how Maxis would want you to remember their game, and honestly, good for you if that's how you remember Spore. I for one had the great idea of making a video about it, so I went back and intentionally and yes, willingly played Spore in 2025, and it's alright. All I can say is, I cannot in any circumstances blame you if that's what comes to your mind when you think of Spore, or this, or that. I can't even show that. But considering the legacy the game laid out through the years, those are pretty valid answers. Unfortunately, you cannot choose what keeps you relevant, but there were times in which Spore was seen in a more noble light. Actually, to some of us, Spore represented a dream inside gaming, and especially the simulation community, a sim everything, a game that promised to simulate life itself, make your own species, evolve it, create your own path, all features that were present individually in many games but were never so unified. So seeing a big player in the market like EA to tackle all of that at once felt really fresh and unique, and giving this daring project to the same hands that created The Sims and SimCity was basically the gaming equivalent to a Michelin star at the time. And we were right. This man had already created simulations with so much personality, taking things you never thought would be fun in a game like working your ass off to pay rent. So he had already kind of done it. This next project was ambitious, sure, but they wouldn't lie to us. Yeah, they did. Big time. But I don't want you thinking this is just one more video talking about the massive disappointment a game is. Actually, there are a lot of those saying that about Spore already. That's not what I intend to do here, cause Spore has something different about it. This is not your modern archetype of a hyped game's failure. Spore is about an idea that could revolutionize gaming, but it didn't. Spore had a really promising alpha version, which was lost. So Spore is not only a game that failed, it is one of the best examples of how great ideas get lost in this industry. So no, this is not a review of the game Spore. This is an in-depth analysis of how Spore, the original idea, was killed by its ambition, publicity, corporate decisions, and design choices. This is Gaming Backdoor. Let's start. One of the most common problems in media when it comes to big projects that lead to even bigger disappointments is the marketing. Many times a studio will sell the hell out of a game, especially if they already know just how bad the game is turning out to be. So it becomes this double-edged sword that might save the game from being a financial failure, but still draw so much hate from a deceived community that it risks killing the entire franchise or the studio's reputation even. And I'm not pointing any fingers, but
how will it be when you can choose? When we all meet out there, what big things will be? How will you create the universe?
this is actually how Spore was marketed, at least before they actually had to show the game that was a whole mess of its own. It's really hard not to think of this as straight up lying. There is not a single file, version, or document that references the game as anything like a god simulator, planet creator, or anything like that. And I'm not trying to be the annoying actually guy, I just don't get it. It's always been about creating and evolving your own species, which is already a huge scope to work with. So why lie like that? Why create such unnecessary expectations? It seems like Spore's marketing team appealed to what's may be the strongest selling point for any kind of interactive experience: freedom. But as we know nowadays with hundreds of examples, freedom in games is the definition of easier said than done. Laying out a playable simulation that feels so dynamic and endless, where at least most of your decisions actually matter, I'm not sure you can even fill one hand with the number of games that actually achieved something like that. And Spore sure as hell ain't one of them. And still, that's how they did it. By promising the same freedom that so many hyped games tend to promise us, just as so many fail to deliver it. The truth is, Spore was never even half of what we expected, which yes happens with dozens of AAA games in what feels like an annual event at this point, but it's different from games like No Man's Sky or Fallout 76, where you had developers come to interviews and say things like,
And this time it features all new rendering, lighting, and landscape technology. It allows us to have 16 times the detail and even view distant weather systems across the map.
basically just talking about a game that's just not real and never was. I mean, the create the universe bit was never true, but the gritty science-based RPG, that was real. So it's not that Spore was completely lied about. It was rather taken from us. The foundation for the game was actually there and in the exact way Will Wright envisioned. There's a whole half an hour presentation of the alpha version of the game, which showed more promise and character than all initial 4 stages of the final game. And the first few minutes of Will playing the demo's creature stage just brings the release version to shame. Especially when you consider they still had 3 whole years to work on that foundation. Creatures seemed more free to wander instead of just being limited to the surroundings of their nests. And from having creatures wander in different ways, you could see more of a breathing food chain on the planet. So there is a bigger variety of encounters you can have, instead of just going from nest A to nest B. AI creatures can also walk around individually, so the whole ecosystem seems way more organic. And as Will said,
now, the game actually builds kind of a balanced ecosystem, so you're not always the top of the food chain here.
Combat also looked more natural instead of a cartoon fight, and you could drag bodies while eating them, a mechanic I'll never understand why it got cut. But the biggest loss of all is undeniably the underwater stage. A whole stage that was supposed to be located between the cell and creature one, and as PC Gamer magazine suggested, you would have the option to create a whole underwater civilization with it. Build your own Atlantis if you'd like, which actually sounds pretty amazing. So it begs the question, like, why? Why didn't we get that? But as I was writing this script, I quickly but reluctantly started to notice that no matter how much I as a fan romanticized the ideal of this alpha version in my head, I just couldn't unsee it. This whole concept, it seems like a mess. And a big one. Yeah, I get that it's an alpha version, and though there were some things that were really impressive, the whole game felt lacking still, because of how much it really tried to do. I get the idea of making each section or stage of the gameplay as a whole different game, but that means you have to make at least 5 actually good on their own games that had to somehow interact with each other in a certain way, which for a big brand like EA doesn't sound like a project that investors would be really willing to give developers the time they need. Spore is a super game, if that's something people say, but just look at it. It's maybe one of, if not the biggest challenge in all of game design. You cannot make this in 3 years, it's just impossible. There's just not enough time. Like a wise woman once said, timing's a bitch. This is perhaps the only aspect of Spore's collapse that doesn't really take anyone to blame. There are dozens of cases in which brilliant ideas were born in times where technology just couldn't attend properly to that project's needs. And that's part of the risk when striving for innovation, and I don't think Spore escapes that. The technology available in 2005 simply couldn't deliver the game Will Wright was dreaming of. Sure, Spore could have and should have turned out a lot better than it did, but even in the best case scenario with the best design choices, it was never going to have the scale, depth or variety that players were going to expect. Planets would still all feel the same and look like an ugly ball of Play-Doh with little to see and even less to do. Gameplay could be better, but the factor of having 5 different systems inside the same game for each stage makes me wonder how much of an improvement was really possible. In game development or any kind of production, excess of scale or scope kills depth. It costs way too much for a team to create these kinds of procedural experiences, especially in a time where no one really knew how to use this kind of tech. And that's when you need to make cuts. Big ideas demand big resources. If you look at other pioneering games that introduced new tech or mechanics, like Super Mario 64 with 3D platforming, or even early Minecraft with procedural survival, you'll notice one thing in common. Both games stayed focused on its core idea, because it takes time for developers to really understand how to tackle these new concepts. So also expecting them to make a game this big is probably not the best idea if you want a finished product. And on top of all that, concepts like these are also not for everyone. So it's not only expensive, but an overall commercial risk. EA executives would surely be way happier spending this kind of money on a established IP or genre like FIFA or Battlefield. And that's probably why they started to push the team at Maxis for a more marketable and simplified version of the original demo, which leads us to the final nail in the coffin. There's nothing wrong with making a game that sells. Trends exist for a reason. Some genres dominate because they naturally connect with bigger audiences. But success in this industry is far from being exclusive to these main structures of gameplay. You don't need to look deep to find entire communities hungry for a game that speaks to their passion, which can really be anything. And when a game delivers on that passion, no matter how weird it is, that's a goldmine. Take Sea of Thieves as an example, or No Man's Sky, Factorio, or even Microsoft Flight Simulator. These aren't just games, they're love letters to their audiences, a representation of their passion that, even with their flaws, they stood strong and will probably stay that way for many years to come. So why couldn't Spore do the same? Evolution, creation, or space are all rich and really amazing things, which I'm sure I'm not the only one who'd love to see them properly combined. But for that to work, a game has to go all the way, it has to commit to its idea entirely, which in simulations means adding depth and complexity to your game. That doesn't oblige you to make a Star Citizen out of it, a game so hard players need a sheet just to remember keybinds. There are tons of examples that show how depth and accessibility can coexist, like Civilization, Stardew Valley, City Skylines, and many others that prove complex games can be approachable. But there's one consistent trait between all these examples I just gave. They're all from small or mid-sized studios, or as Stardew Valley's case, just one dude. But that condition creates a breathing space for developers to make the game they actually aspire to, without the pressure of a big publisher breathing down their necks the whole time. But sadly, Spore just didn't have that option, as its concept in itself not only required really expensive technology and a lot of development time, as we said before, also its creator was already tied to EA by contract. So Will and the staff at Maxis just had to endure the expectations of executors who wouldn't necessarily understand the heart of the project. And it shows. The sudden shift in Spore's development essentially boils down to one major reason: accessibility. As the game initially grew to become more of a complex procedural RPG, some thought it seemed unappealing or too complicated for younger audiences. It became difficult for investors to keep supporting a project that costed way too much and had little proof or indication that it was going to sell well. So the team at Maxis became divided between two groups. Group A being the one that wanted to stick to the original approach and making a realistic, gritty simulation, and then there was Group B, or what Will called the cute group, the ones that wanted to stick to the studio's old Sims formula, a lighthearted, caricatured world built for the player's creativity to thrive within a specific set of rules. Years later, in an interview, Will said they managed to reach a good balance between those two approaches. Really? Like, really, Will? Do you really believe in that. But don't get me wrong here, I'm not saying the game shouldn't be lighthearted. There were moments in the original demo that had its quirks and a charm to it. I honestly think most of Spore's strengths come from its quirkiness or how it doesn't take itself too seriously. The movie references or how the god of the game's universe is really just a high-pitched UFO called Steve. Striking that tone was never really a struggle for Maxis. The real problem is when a lighthearted or comical tone starts being used as a crutch, an excuse for oversimplification of other aspects of the game, like its gameplay, which has mechanics so shallow they feel like an afterthought. A big scope means nothing if you're just checking boxes. Spore's gameplay is what The Sims would feel like if it had the gameplay depth of My Sims. Same idea and size, but without any of the underlying systems, just an empty shell. Because that's surely how it feels. You get 4 stages before space that look and feel more like a demo than a finished product, and sometimes they drag on, repeating the same brain-dead task again and again until you start fantasizing about smacking your head on the wall just so you remember what it's like to feel something. Other times they're so short it feels like the game is always taken away from you just when you're starting to get the hang of it. It's important to remember superficial is not a design choice, simplicity is, and when backed by a well-rounded system, a really powerful one at that. Take Shelter for example, a game where you feel the shoes or paws of a mother badger protecting her cubs during a long migration. The gameplay is as simple as it can be, and it should. You have the ability to run, jump, crouch, pick up items, and that's it. But the emotional stakes run deep in this game, because if one of your cubs dies, it's permanent. So every little decision matters. The game's context makes the gameplay work. To add anything else would make it feel dull or useless for its premise. And that's the problem. Spore tries to do so much but doesn't take its time into justifying its own features. So a lot of it feels pointless. What's the appeal of being a herbivore and in later stages more of a pacifist/social creature instead of a penis-shaped warmonger if the gameplay for a pacifist looks like this? It's incredibly repetitive and mind-numbing. And remember, to get through the whole creature stage as a pacifist, you'll have to do that 20 times. At least. Why would you choose this when the game is constantly luring you with its combat system that feels like 80% of the game's features, with different combat body parts, combat units, combat vehicles, and styles? And I'm not saying picking the violent path will magically turn the game into a masterpiece, but if you're going to make me do the same tasks for so long, at least make it fun. It's pretty much impossible to not use these mechanics without feeling like you're missing out from a huge part of what the game has to offer. But what does this game really have to offer? Well, incredibly, with all its problems and misdirections, the game still had something to show for itself. Yes, the project was pretty much doomed from the beginning, but Maxis was still Maxis, the studio who never put out a single fart without striving for innovation. And Spore was no different. The game's biggest strength is and will always be its customization, enhanced by how powerful the editors were for its time. The creature creator is still impressive to this day. You can stretch, mold, and snap the hell out of that thing, and it still moves. It still does the whole animation set for the entire game. This is procedural technology being made and properly used in 2005. There's a reason they released just this editor as a demo before game launch. There was nothing quite like it, and there still isn't. I've always defended that creation features inside games must have in-game value. Not to shit on games like Tiny Glade or Townscaper, those are great tools for art in itself, but when there's a conventional game, a world of objectives and interactive gameplay for your creations to fill, that gives so much more value to what you've done. What's the point of building Lego if I can't play with it? And even with its shortcomings, Spore really gives room for the player-made abominations to shine. To see your species going from a literal shit stain on the ocean to ruling the planet and then go into space, I cannot deny how fun it is, even if some parts are short-lived or repetitive. And I'm aware that a lot of games can give you great tools for creation, but very few are so well designed to make the player look good, to make anything you create look like an actual part of the game, rather than a garage mod asset. People who've had any experience with 3D know what I'm talking about. There's so much that goes into making objects in a consistent visual style, and in Spore you don't ever have to worry about any of that, because it's already designed to do that for you, while still allowing you to create basically any weird idea that comes to mind. They've managed to compress a whole chunk of tasks that usually takes artists weeks into a few clicks. Will knew the creature creator would be a major attraction to casual players, so he needed it to be as accessible as possible, and that's what I think is the biggest hidden strength of Spore, its accessibility. Yes, the exact point I was criticizing like 5 minutes ago. It's a double-edged sword. You see, in video essays it's very easy to look at games through the critical eyes of a hardcore or at least not so casual gamer, because that's the majority of us who are interested in this kind of analysis and content. But having been a kid who held Spore as my favorite game for many years, even though it surely wasn't the best game I've played even at the time, I can't ignore how perfect of an introduction to gaming Spore can be. It's not just about customization. Of course, making something of your own is highly engaging to newcomers, but the diversity of gameplay presented to me throughout all 5 stages was mesmerizing for 5-year-old me. 2D arcade, third-person RPG, real-time strategy, and open-world sandbox. It got me introduced to whole genres of gameplay that otherwise might have been too complicated for me to understand at my age at the time. It manages to teach new players all of these different mechanics in an almost perfect amount of challenge, so it never feels like it's too much for you. A kind of balance that more experienced players will sadly lose over time. Even the hardest difficulty, the game becomes just too easy, while as a beginner you're always encouraged to try and do more, if only there was so much more to keep doing once you get past a certain point. I feel like the main reason Spore works so well for casual players is because Maxis was always better at making toys rather than conventional games with narrative, predetermined goals, and so on. Maxis was always more focused on the sandbox side of things, where it's not about telling the player what to do, but instead giving players the tools so they can decide what to do for themselves and make it easy to do so. And Spore does not fall short on that metric, at least on the customization side. It gives you so much to do and mess with, combined with this huge database with all the content that other players created. It's amazing how much the game lets you just go crazy with it. So yeah, in the end, Will did produce a really impressive product, which unfortunately didn't amount to a great game, and Spore really needed that, if it wanted to be half as great as its idea. In the end, I loved Spore. Really. If you've checked this channel's page, you'd probably notice this is my very first video, and that's not a coincidence. Spore is what made me fall in love with this industry. I'm not saying it was my first game ever, as I've mentioned before, but surely the first one that made me realize this medium could be so much more than just pure and plain fun. It opened my eyes to how deep gaming can go as a life experience, how it can shape up real lasting memories. Yes, this game, I've been shitting on for 20-30 minutes saying it's a superficial mess. This game made me feel curious, tense, scared, happy, and even accomplished as a child, something that was completely new for me for obvious reasons. And now, over a decade later, I can safely say that very few games managed to make me feel like that ever again. Of course, I now realize that most of life's experiences will never have the same wonder they once had through my eyes as a child, but nothing takes away the impact that certain mediums can have on us. This video was actually supposed to be a love letter to Spore, the game game that changed the course of my whole life, but the more I played it and analyzed the game as a whole, it was just too much to ignore. It would be way easier to just make a toast to Spore, the idea, the lost dream, but if I did that, it wouldn't just be dishonest. I'd be neglecting the things I learned in this very same road Spore led me to, which was to become a game designer. So the most honest way to really do this is to treat Spore for what it is. First of all, for the bravery and ambition of its idea, but recognize its flaws as also part of it, and just try my best to use it as an example for the future. Because flawed as it may be, will undeniably create one of the most unique games in history. I mean, my Naruto Adventures was also pretty unique, but that doesn't make it good. But you get what I mean. There's still a bittersweet beauty in Spore for what it is and what it tried to be. An honest attempt at near perfection. One of the very few times a major publisher actually tried something different. Even with its changes, there's nothing like Spore, and I'm really hoping that changes soon.